Naachtun is located in the far north of Guatemala, near the Mexican border, hidden away in the depths of the rainforest. It is so hard to reach that since its discovery in 1922, no serious expeditions have attempted to excavate it. And this Maya city has been totally forgotten. That is, until two French archaeologists, Philippe Nondeodeo and Dominique Michelet, began reading the reports by the man who discovered it.
Naachtun is a Mayan word, but it was invented by the first visitors at the site, Sylvanus Morley, who was a leading specialist and who spent a large part of his life looking for ancient remains. Morley came here in the 1920s and had a real struggle to reach the place. He thought it was the most out-of-the-way place he'd ever found, and he called it Naachtun, tun meaning stone, and nash for far, giving distant stones or totally out-of-the-way ruins. So that's what Naachtun means. It has nothing to do with the traditional ancient name of the site, when people actually lived here, of course.
Sylvanus Morley was not the first 20th century man to have penetrated the Guatemalan forest. Back then, workers known as chicleros were sent here to find a natural gum called chicle, which was used to make the first chewing gums. These workers, who were usually Mayas themselves, traveled the forests, discovering cities, engravings, and ruins, and brought the information back to their bosses. The North American companies that employed them informed the architects of the day. And that's how Sylvanus Morley ended up at Naachtun for the first time. Today, the Naachtun camp is home to 80 people. There is a team handling logistics, archaeologists, and workers, all of whom have spent every winter here for the past 5 years. On the first morning of the dig, the archaeologists' heads are spinning. Will they ever be able to understand this city, to link its fate to that of its prestigious neighbors, or imagine the lives of its inhabitants? They only have 60 days this year to tell the story of this Maya city, from its dawn to its twilight. In this forest, every mound is a buried building. Every change in relief hides the possibility of an unexpected discovery. The vegetation that invaded the city and erosion are threatening to destroy the most interesting monuments here.
When we arrived at the site, we quickly discovered almost 600 structures that represent residential areas where the majority of the city's residents lived. So with all the temples, pyramids, main squares, and palaces that tell us the history as we understand it at the present time, because every year we are discovering additional monuments, we have currently recorded around 70 tablets and altars in the city.
The first difficulty is obviously the forest. For a very long time, we couldn't get an overall view of what we were dealing with. So where the architecture is still standing, there are a certain number of buildings in Naachtun that still have their facades at this moment, and there's no problem. But when it all collapsed, it becomes a pile, and that becomes a hill when you're talking about the big ones, so it's quite easy to confuse a natural hill with the remains of an ancient temple. There are hundreds of buildings, and recording these hundreds of buildings in reality represents years of work.
What is Naashtun's history? How did this city develop, and what role did it play in the Maya lowlands? There is an impressive list of mysteries here for architects to solve. And for now, at the beginning of the dig, these vestiges are not revealing their secrets. For the researchers, the story begins with the edifices that were constructed when the city was first established, like these three temples that face each other and which we call a triadic group. They form the center of all Maya cities, although we don't really know what their function was.
One of the first theories was that perhaps these temples represented the three stones upon which food was cooked. And this gives the idea of some kind of cosmogony that would put a primordial hearth at the center, the first hearth that existed at the moment of creation, where something had to be cooked on those three stones, and the three temples represent these three stones. That was an initial theory, although since then, some have suggested that perhaps these temples were related to a cult of maize, combined with the elements essential to it. First, the rain, and then the sun. That could be a possibility. And we also know that there was a political dimension to their system. So it was probably the place where political events took place, and perhaps even the inauguration of chiefs.
What did the triadic group look like?
What are your coordinates?
30123.
For the past 5 years, the archaeology work has been accompanied by a similar amount of surveying. Using topographic data, first a map of the city was drawn up. Then, the buildings were compared to those in neighboring cities. 3D modeling then allows us to see what the city might have looked like at different stages in its existence.
At the point where we're at now, we'll settle with what we can see in terms of surface area.
When the triadic group was constructed at the end of the 3rd century, Naachtun was just beginning its expansion. The first palaces were created and the first pyramid constructed. But how did this city emerge so quickly? How did a little hamlet with a few hundred inhabitants become a capital, home to thousands of people? For Dominique Michelet, the answer to these questions may come from a neighboring Maya city, El Mirador. El Mirador was one of the first great Maya cities. It emerged well before Naachtun in around 600 BC. At its height, it was home to more than 80,000 inhabitants. The North American archaeologist Richard Hansen started digging here when he was a student.
When you're flying at this height, you can clearly see the sites because the pyramids really stand out. And of course, the biggest is this one.
In the 2nd century AD, when Naachtun emerged, it seems that El Mirador was not faring too well. Is the rise of Naachtun perhaps linked to the decline of El Mirador?
From here, we can see the capital of the world in its day, when it was at its height. And down there in the shadows, we can see the Great Pyramid of La Muerta. It's not the biggest in terms of volume, but it's one of the highest. And imagine, with no horses, no wagons, no oxen, no mules. All that was built with human blood and pain.
Good. For this construction, we can calculate the volume by taking Abraham's estimates.
Yes, we calculated it as 15 million days' work. 15 million days.
Very recently, Richard Hansen discovered a building in the middle of the forest of El Mirador, whose angles are covered with sumptuous stucco reliefs. This was just one of dozens of buildings on the site.
We've covered 38 square kilometers of monumental architecture. But not only did they have big buildings and palaces and platforms and causeways, but they had extraordinary garden systems. They were the green cities. Every available square meter of the city was productive, and they were raising squash, beans, corn, and cotton. So they were raising all these products here, and that gave them, again, the economic power to build this amazing city. And not only that, but the causeways that they formed allowed them to link all these other cities together too, which created then what we consider to be the first state-level society in the Western Hemisphere.
At its height, El Mirador was more important than any of the neighboring cities. However, the discovery of a defensive system shows that the most important Maya city of the time was the source of much envy.
Well, Dominique, welcome to the El Mirador Control Center. From here you can go straight to the La Danta Pyramid, which is quite impressive. The wall was there, and we think it may originally have been 20 meters high. 20 meters high.
Did that wall run the whole eastern length of the site?
Yes, over 4 kilometers.
It enclosed the city by the south and north?
Yes, it did.
It's an interesting clue because in terms of what happened in El Mirador at the end, there were probably also political difficulties with various threats in the region around this site, which was, remember, probably even bigger at the time. So they built this wall with a certain number of gates, which were extremely well guarded. Actually, over time, there were fewer and fewer of them, which is another clue to the growing threat. And then one day it all ended, and it all ended badly.
Between the years 150 and 200 AD, the city was abandoned. The inhabitants of El Mirador mysteriously disappeared.
The population dispersed, but where did they go? Probably into the surrounding areas. And given that Naachtun was 20 kilometers away from there, one might imagine, even if we're still lacking any proof, that a certain number of people did settle in Naachtun around 150 AD, who came from El Mirador.
This is the 10th day of the dig. In Naachtun, the archaeologists are getting down to work under the intrigued gaze of the people who live in the forest. The first walls are appearing, the first reliefs emerging, and soon they discover a grave. For Hemamute Gudiabi, this is a chance to meet one of the inhabitants of Naachtun and to understand the funeral rites of this people.
The way the Maya people bury their dead is a bit of a mystery because we've found very few bodies considering the size of the sites. Here, for example, we're breaking up the floor that is made of stucco, which is a sort of plaster, and dig down in the rubble. They put it in a certain position according to a certain orientation, and sometimes with certain items, which depends on the status of the person, of course. The most important people were buried in funeral temples, while ordinary people made do with the place where they lived. I find it very, very difficult to describe what you feel when you reveal something like that. It's a whole series of things. There's distress before you get it out. There's relief when you get it out in one piece. There's satisfaction in seeing the complete form. And then there's the simple pleasure of holding it. It's both simple and complicated.
Very often, dishes or plates are placed over the heads of the dead, and most of them have a hole through the middle. This practice has long been a source of mystery for archaeologists.
This means two things. Firstly, there were ritual killings. The dish, by making a hole in it, means there's no further utility to it. And secondly, according to some, it enabled the soul of the dead person to go to heaven or to the beyond. In the Maya civilization, not everything is living, but everything is animated. Everything is symbolically, magically animated, and then when you stop using an object or a space, you have to de-animate the object. So making a hole in the dish is a way of de-animating the object and setting it up for its new destiny, which is to accompany the dead in their lives in the afterworld.
Day 20. Every day, the city of Naachtun grows bigger, more widespread, and more enigmatic. But the story of its inhabitants, century after century, remains difficult to decipher.
Are they bones or ceramics?
I'm not sure. There might be traces of something else.
To find out more about it, the archaeologists have undertaken parallel digs, a long and painstaking job based on some seemingly anodyne clues. These ceramic fragments are a mine of information. By comparing them to known ceramics, their shape and decoration allow us to date the buildings in which they were found. But that's not all. Alessandro Patino, the project's ceramic expert, has made an interesting discovery. This ceramic found at Naachtun is decorated with a famous dancer, the dancer of Tikal. This is a clue to the relationship between Naachtun and this royal city, and at the same time, sheds some light on the next part of the story. Between 200 and 550 AD, the allegiances of the Maya world were shared by two superpowers. Calakmul, 40 kilometers to the north of Naachtun, which vied for supremacy with Tikal, 60 kilometers to the south. In the 4th century, Tikal was the dominant city. Often at war, the city developed quickly and gained the upper hand over neighboring towns. But perhaps it became too influential because a third player who had nothing to do with the Maya civilization was unhappy about this regional powerhouse that was emerging. Teotihuacan in Mexico was more than 1,000 kilometers away. It was a huge city that enjoyed political, economic, and religious influence across the whole of Central America. To Teotihuacan, Tikal was a potential enemy and had to be dominated. But how could Teotihuacan conquer Tikal? And did Naachtun play a role in this conquest? Until now, archaeologists have found it hard to believe that an army of warriors from Teotihuacan could have marched more than 1,000 kilometers to defeat Tikal. There was no real evidence of a conflict. However, this proof did exist. But the archaeologists in Naachtun had gone past it several times without noticing. The story was right there, on the face of the stones. All they had to do was to decode it. Last year, Philippe Nondeodeo decided to work together with a renowned epigraphist, Alfonso Lacadena. Alfonso examined all the stones in Naachtun, and this medium-sized one in particular. It is not the most imposing stone on this site, but it is, without doubt, the most enlightening. It revealed the strategy deployed by Cinq, the Teotihuacan emissary.
This is what it said.
Bolon, Ok, Minanguaye, Bujol, Uyahaute, Sillaccac. Es una maravilla.
It's absolutely amazing to be able to read what they're telling us.
The
text describes the king of Naachtun as Siegkak's military leader. This is very important because it confirms that the arrival of Teotihuacanos in Petén Maya was not an action undertaken by them alone, but that Maya groups joined in with them. And the king of Naachtun participated actively in this military conflict.
Naachtun allied with Teotihuacan against Tikal. Thanks to their troop numbers and the provisioning potential that Naachtun could offer, the army under Cinq would have been able to take on Tikal.
I'd be embarrassed to tell you what I did when I discovered the stone. I was extremely emotional. It's rare in a professional career to come across a monument as important as this one. It was a gift, an undreamt of piece of professional luck.
On 16 January 378, the Teotihuacan emissary arrived at the gates of Tikal with troops from Naachtun. The king of the city was captured, and no doubt sacrificed, and replaced by the son of the Teotihuacan leader. Tikal then becomes the most powerful city in the Maya lowlands.
'95, 23, 95. Is that the original wall?
In the chaos of stones, ruined walls, and collapsed temples, the archaeologists are trying to understand how Naachtun changed after this episode.
Here we are on the pyramid. You have to imagine that there is a monumental staircase that goes from this side, and behind us, there is a square, with this huge area below it, with a central square and buildings all around it. As soon as you see it, you know it's a pyramid. Big foundations with a square in the middle.
The first topographical studies of this construction revealed the shapes still somewhat vague of the temples constructed one after the other. For Philippe, this was the city's funeral acropolis. Constructed just like the necropolis in Tikal, it is home to the tombs of the first great kings of Naachtun.
What is amazing and what really struck us when we came here for the first time in 2010 is these finger marks here. They used a mud coating here that was applied by hand. So you can see the marks their fingers left where the mud was smoothed over the stones fairly clearly here on the wall. That gives you a direct connection with the king's workers who constructed this chamber. The walls are covered with a kind of stucco that was painted red. It's hematite. So they used a fairly precious material that is quite difficult to get a hold of, which shows the status of the king and his capacity to get his hands on sought-after raw materials and prestigious goods.
Hundreds of years later, these riches attracted looters. More than 300 illegally dug tunnels have been discovered in the site of Naachtun. And the acropolis was one of the first victims.
All the information taken away by looters is information we will never recover. So, for example, if there was a name painted, sculpted, or etched on a royal container, that's information we will never get back. So here, we have a lovely chamber, very well built for an important person, but one that will never be able to link to a dynasty that we might have been able to establish from the epigraphy. So yes, there is a great deal of frustration.
At the start of the 5th century, the huge acropolis would have looked down over the west of the site. Further to the east, another square, a palace, and an imposing pyramid would have transformed this little town into a regional capital that could now rival Tikal. The city was home to thousands of people. Craftsmen and farmers for the most part, they would have cultivated in little fields and exploited the resources the forest had to offer. The forests of Petén are home to thousands of animal and plant species. The Mayas used the trees for construction, firewood, and fruit. They hunted animals there to feed themselves. But for these people, this natural environment was much more than a source of food. The various species in the forest represent natural forces. Here, every creature has a master spirit, and divinities are constantly revealing themselves. Night is falling in Naachtun. The dig has been going for 40 days now. In the camp, everyone has developed their own habits. When night falls, the temperature is cooler, and little groups form to hang out together. Away from his colleagues, Dominique is back on his travels, examining the 7th and 8th centuries of Maya history. What happened to Naachtun during this period? And where might he be able to find some clues? During this period, large and small kingdoms fought one another in merciless wars. Alliances and betrayals happened in a heartbeat. Rulers were overthrown and new powers emerged. Calakmul, the seat of the Snake Kingdom, had previously kept itself to itself, but now started to extend its influence and power. Naachtun, allied with Tikal for centuries, was concerned by the rise in power of this city-state with a population of some 40,000 inhabitants. What role would it play in this emerging rivalry?
The kingdom of the snake in the history of classical Maya worlds was a major kingdom and much discussed in many sites. It was a kingdom that was imposing itself, spreading its influence in all directions. It was a conquering, expansionist kingdom, and its kings, who believed they were descendants of the snake, wanted to extend their power in all directions.
At the time, Tikal was seen by Calakmul as an enemy to fight. To gain the upper hand over its great rival, Calakmul gradually encircled and controlled it, suffocating the towns that remained loyal to Tikal.
Those years when Calakmul was at the height of its powers were a critical period in the history of Naachtun. That was the only time in its history when Naachtun was really dominated by the Khan dynasty and by Calakmul.
Did Naachtun abandon Tikal for Calakmul? Was it dominated by the Snake Kings? Until now, no archaeological evidence has enabled this to be clearly established. And yet proof did exist at the foot of one particular building in the form of a princess.
We know she is a princess by her long skirt, a huipil, which goes down to her ankles, and which is decorated with a lattice pattern. And on each cross, you might imagine that there was a shellfish there. This lattice pattern is fairly characteristic of the princesses of Calakmul. So finding this long skirt here on a princess in Naachtun tells us that she is a Calakmul princess who came here to Naachtun to marry the local king.
But why was this princess decapitated? And why was she found underneath a staircase? For the archaeologists, this was deliberate. The stele was buried so that it could be walked over by the inhabitants of Naachtun. She commemorates the victory and emancipation of the city. This new autonomy can be seen in the expansion of the city. Several new and closely packed residential areas emerged. This was an important development that contrasts with the experiences of most Maya cities. In the lowlands, the conflicts between major cities seemed endless. The Maya kingdoms were in perpetual competition that meant a permanent state of war. In Tikal, a new king led the city back to prominence with newfound riches and renewed pride. He led the fight against Calakmul and this time was victorious. But a few years later, Tikal collapsed once again, and the entire Maya civilization, which had flourished until then, now went into decline. Between 760 and 950 AD, the majority of the great Maya cities were emptied of their populations. At the same time, as Naachtun was observing the downfall of its rivals, it was experiencing the peak of its powers. What was its secret? To find out, the archaeologists looked at a series of prestigious homes.
In 750, the city was undergoing radical change. Certain neighborhoods were abandoned, and the living quarters were concentrated here in two large courtyard spaces that were built to house a certain number of families. These spaces were constructed with the new central square, which would become the new political heart of the city. It was as if the city was reorganized in around 750.
This reorganization coincides with the last traces and last remaining signs of royalty in the history of Naachtun.
This building looks over at the pyramid. The occupier would have come out and seen the pyramid in front of him, so it would have been someone important. We also know that they were important people because of the objects we have found. There are some lovely things. So these really were houses belonging to society's elite.
While the cities around gradually crumbled, Naachtun was going through its second golden age.
We have a paradox towards the end of the city's period of occupation because there is this prosperity, which was fairly sudden and very intense, which lasted for a century or a century and a half, and which at the same time would result in the inexorable abandonment of the city.
Guatemala City. Some archaeologists have already left the dig and started upon a task that will also help shed light on the inhabitants of Naachtun. Some ceramics have been restored, revealing their original form for the first time in centuries. Mylène Bourdely is the dig's archaeozoologist and has made a surprising discovery. She has found an example of the emblematic animal of the Maya people among her samples.
Until now, I'd found animals that were eaten, such as deer and peccaries. And I set this bag to one side because it was from a tomb. When I started to go through it, I found a foot bone. And I realized it was a carnivore, a young one. And after a while, I realized it was a big cat, and that all the pieces were there, which was great.
The jaguar was the emblematic animal of the Maya. It was a symbol of power and courage, and often associated with warriors as well as priests and royalty.
The jaguar is often associated with the elite and can represent the animal spirit associated with an individual, such as a prince. So one might imagine that when the prince died, they decided to sacrifice the animal associated with him. But there is also the fact that the jaguar and the great carnivores in general accompanied the dead into the beyond. Especially because for both the Mayas and the Mesoamerica in general, the jaguar wasn't just a nocturnal animal, but an animal from the infraworld.
Over the course of this project, almost 30 burial sites have been excavated. Each skeleton has been removed for an almost pathological examination. The aim is to gather information about how the inhabitants of Naachtun lived. Today, the team's anthropologist, Isaac Barrientos, is getting to know a woman aged around 25.
In the beginning, I wanted to discover how ancient populations lived, how they adapted to different ecosystems. What were the indicators affecting their health, for example? For instance, on their teeth, we can see the events that occurred while they were growing. Tooth enamel allows us to identify alterations When there is a developmental imbalance while we are growing up, it leaves a line. Here you can see at least two lines that suggest two major perturbations during the development of this individual.
How did this young woman die? Did she suffer from malnutrition? Was her life so hard that it killed her? Across all Maya sites, the examination of dozens of skeletons has revealed signs of deprivation or stress from the end of the 8th century onwards. At the same time that most of these monumental cities were being emptied of their inhabitants. How can we explain the mysterious collapse of classical Maya civilization? Archaeologists have been pondering this question for many years and have put forward a range of different theories. Endemic wars between the different cities may have weakened Maya royalty. Natural catastrophes like hurricanes could have frightened their inhabitants away, or epidemics could have decimated Maya populations. Over in El Mirador, Richard Hansen has another idea.
To understand a collapse, you have to understand the reasons why it became a superpower. You cannot have a collapse without destroying the things that made you great in the first place. We find, for example, in the case here, there were environmental problems. We have evidence of a drought episode. But even more importantly, we find the evidence of human abuse of their environmental system. For example, just to cover the final layer of Tigre pyramid required the complete removal of 600 hectares of forest of every single living tree, just to make the last layer of lime for that building. It's not they didn't want to come back, it's they couldn't come back. They couldn't renovate those fields. The thing that gave them life was destroyed. The thing that generated the economic power was destroyed. I look at the world debts of societies today, and I see the same mentality.
For Richard Hansen, the massive overexploitation of the forest led to the disappearance of El Mirador. In Naachtun, Lydie Dussault wanted to test this hypothesis. Lydie is an archaeobotanist. She is studying relationships between Maya society and its natural environment. Her research involves taking samples of the trees the Mayans mainly used.
This is the famous Chico Zapote.
Lydie wants to know how much charcoal can be obtained from this particular species of tree. She then compares the results with the quantity of charcoal found in the tombs and houses. She's trying to establish whether some tree varieties have disappeared over time. One tree in particular, the Chico Zapote, gives her a strong indication of an answer.
Until the end of the occupation, this tree was very commonly found. But it's a tree that is common in tall, ancient forests, so that would suggest that until the end of the site's occupation, there were still areas of very ancient forest close by the site. To me, it's a clear clue that casts doubt on the hypothesis of massive deforestation during the Terminal Classic period, between 800 to 1000 AD.
Wars between cities, epidemics, natural catastrophes, or overexploitation of the land and the forest. At Naachtun, the scientists have not dismissed the theory of massive deforestation, but they are now closely examining the possible effects of climate change. And the marshlands, which were an indirect witness to the life of the city, could provide the answer they have been seeking since they began their excavations. Cyril Castanet is a geographer who is interested in a very particular aspect to the ruins, far from the jade and multicolored ceramics. These sediments, deposited at the bottom of the water hundreds of years ago, may reveal a great many surprises.
Here we have two different layers, a darker layer and a lighter one. This dark layer is mainly made from clay and organic deposits, debris from branches and moss, etc. And then this light layer, which is very different to the other, is mainly made of gray clay. When you look a little closer, you see a great many remains of shells, little snails. So here we have a recording, a memory of a past environment, and a record of environmental changes that occurred in the past.
For Cyril, reading this section allows him to imagine how the landscape and climate of Naachtun changed.
I think that here we really have evidence of the presence of a permanent lake, a body of water that was here year-round, and of a change with a transition towards an environment that was more continental, boggy, and earthy as it is now. It shows that the disappearance of this lake and the local decline of Maya societies around Naachtun happened around the same time.
Did the lake's disappearance bring about the end of Naachtun? Was it triggered by climate change? Our researchers are looking for the slightest clue.
Where are the mollusks?
Right here you can see it's about 3 millimeters.
And your transition here between the black and the grey, that's around 900 to 1000? 900 to 1000 AD, in other words, the time when it was abandoned. Transformations of civilizations often occur when there are major cyclical climatic upheavals. But for a long time, no one has paid any attention to the curious effects of short crises. Climatologists tell us that indeed the entire Maya civilization suffered at certain moments. From 800 onwards, we were in a phase of growing global drought. But what is perhaps more interesting is that within these generalized phases of progressive drought, the years around 810, 860 and around 910 were particularly tough. When there's no harvest for 3 years, what do? You can't go and get a job as a laborer in Cancun because there was no Cancun back then. So people died of hunger, or they left because there was nothing left to eat.
Around 1000 AD, the inhabitants of Naachtun, who had been affected by a series of terrible years, began the rituals that marked their departure from the city. In many places around the site, archaeologists have discovered traces of acts to deconsecrate places of power, as well as people's homes. At the foot of a building that was only half constructed, a last treasure awaits for them. A miniature earthenware jar filled with 400 beads from a rare shellfish, the spondylus, which are normally left in royal tombs. This was a fortune for the Maya, and it's incomprehensible as to why it was simply abandoned on the ground.
Perhaps it was an offering for the masters of the universe, the masters of the crisis that they were going through. And at the same time, it's like a message in a bottle, tossed into the sea. It's very beautiful.
But the masters of this universe did not hear the petitions of the Maya, nor did they retrieve this bottle from the ocean. One by one, the inhabitants of Naachtun left this ancient royal city. And like all its great neighbors, the city could not escape its terrible fate. In Paris, 8 months later, the team members have returned to their labs and are starting their analysis. Thanks to the measurements taken during their last trip, the city is now taking shape. Philippe and Dominique now know the color of the temples and the location of the gardens and forest. Never has a Maya city been reconstructed in such detail. Naachtun, the forgotten settlement, has now entered the world of the great Maya cities. By showing us how a civilization was constructed, how it declined, and how it collapsed in a deteriorating environment, it is sending us its final message.